everyone. My name is Bo Feng, and I'm with the UBC Students for Freedom of Expression. And today joining us, we have JJ McCullough.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and just to let you guys know, JJ's a weekly columnist for the Washington Post and one of the largest Canadian YouTubers who talks about culture, history, and politics, both in Canada and abroad. In my opinion, he presents to his international audience the truth about what Canada and many Canadians are really like, past the often preconceived notion that we live in some hippie paradise with weed and free healthcare. He creates fascinating videos that are properly researched, entertaining, and well edited. I've been a huge fan of all the work JJ's done, both on YouTube and the Washington Post, and I highly recommend everyone to check him out. With that being said, let's just jump straight into the first question. So JJ, the Conservative leadership race is set to end on the 21st. We're expecting the results to come out on the 23rd. For the folks at home, you identify as a conservative who happens to be gay. Just let us know if you have any preferences between the four candidates right now, and do you think any of them have any shot at actually beating Trudeau?
Well, those are two big questions. I mean, the one that I prefer, honestly, is Aaron O'Toole. And I prefer him in the same way that I think a lot of O'Toole supporters prefer him, which is to say that he seems like the candidate with the greatest chance of beating Peter MacKay. And sort of like that is kind of like the existential frame that I think a lot of conservative voters are going into this election sort of viewing it in through that sort of context, right? Do you want Peter MacKay to win? Peter MacKay, I think, is obviously the front runner. He's obviously sort of the media darling. He's the sort of establishment favorite. So the question then becomes, if you view the sort of conservatism that Peter MacKay embodies, which in my mind is sort of the left wing of the party, somebody whose desire, and I think the fundamental political objective of his entire career is to basically minimize the difference between the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. If you don't want that flavor of conservatism to be on the ascendancy, you have to find a viable alternative to that, a viable alternative candidate. And my hope had been that it was going to be Pierre Poilievre, who I think was a very strong, he's obviously a very strong parliamentarian, a very popular figure with the conservative base, but for whatever reason he chose not to run. For whatever reason, not very many people in general chose to run. So you do have a rather thin assortment of candidates who are the next best thing. And that has, I think, necessitated conservatives who do not want to see Peter MacKay win to sort of rally behind Aaron O'Toole, who I think has very consciously marketed himself as the more conservative alternative to Peter MacKay. He projects himself, and his slogan is that I'm a true blue conservative, that I'm going to represent a distinct, an ideological alternative to Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, to be, as Barry Goldwater famously said, a choice, not an echo. And I'm under no illusions that Aaron O'Toole is necessarily the most authentic champion of that sort of flavor of conservatism. You know, he ran in the previous leadership election as very much the very moderate, very centrist, kind of the sort of same sort of political brand that Peter MacKay is running on today. But that being said, you have to sort of play with the tools that you're given, and so that's why I'm supporting Aaron O'Toole. I'm not under any illusions about who he is or the games that he's playing politically, but I think if the objective is to prevent Peter MacKay from winning, you have to support O'Toole.
Right, so in one of your videos where you explain kind of the key differences between all the four candidates, and you kind of labeled MacKay as the one pushing the party to the left, yes, O'Toole as the one kind of being even, and Sloan being the one pushing it to the right, and obviously Leslie Lewis being the one, the Catholic, kind of religious evangelical. Yeah. I guess, is that the push that you want to see the future of the Conservative Party to be in, where it's just more or less the same as what Harper had, or did you want it to be pushed more to the right, or the?
Well, I mean, I think it's sort of difficult to sort of speak of these things in terms of sort of big abstractions, and I'm even sort of feeling self-conscious of the way that I was sort of framing it before, because it's very difficult to clearly articulate what is the right in today's day and age, and what does it mean to be more to the right in sort of today's day and age. I mean, I think that if the best we can hope for is just that Stephen Harper flavor conservatism continues, that's kind of good enough for me, right? I don't really know exactly what it is that, say, someone like Derek Sloan represents, other than to just kind of be louder and angrier in sort of what he's choosing to sort of champion. I think that this has not been a race in which you've seen a lot of substantial policy conversation. It's mostly just been about sort of signaling what faction of the base that you're comfortable around and what faction of the base are you most interested in being the champion of, right? So it's like Peter MacKay very sort of explicitly said early on in the race that he was not interested in being the candidate of social conservatives, right? Which is sort of the euphemistic way we refer to sort of people who would be called on sort of the Christian right, you know, people that are, their politics is sort of more informed by their religious beliefs. And so like that's very much a sort of equation of political subtraction, that he wants to basically exclude that faction from the political coalition that is the Conservative Party altogether, whereas someone like Aaron O'Toole, you know, is comfortable having those people be part of the coalition. I think the perception is that someone like Leslie Lewis wants to see those people in more of like the driving seat, in sort of like the more front and center sort of position in the political coalition. But, you know, like again, like even with somebody like Leslie Lewis, I don't really get the sense that she has a really sort of clear-cut set of policy initiatives that she wants to pursue as informed by this sort of religious right agenda. So, yeah, I mean, I think that if we had a contest that was clearly more being fought on a number of ideas, where if you could clearly say, like, this is what Aaron O'Toole wants, it's clearly to the right of Peter MacKay, is this a good or bad policy in that regard, and therefore is that sort of policy part of some sort of larger right-wing agenda, I think it would be sort of easier to evaluate. But as it stands now, it's mostly just kind of like a game of political marketing, and so if that being the case, like my evaluation is that you don't want a conservative leader whose agenda is to sort of shrink the coalition, to alienate people, to exclude people from it. Because I think that the Harper strategy, for whatever else you want to say about it, I mean, it did win 3 elections. So there is clearly some virtue to sort of continuing that brand, even if that brand has a lot of flaws as well.
Right, of course. So now we're in the midst of the We Charity scandal by Trudeau, and Trudeau has his fair share of scandals in the past few years. But for whatever reason, you know, even despite the media constantly talking about it, it doesn't seem to stick with him, at least in terms of the poll numbers. I guess my question would be, do you really see this current scandal as being the same, or is this actually a significant aspect to his prime ministership?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it seems like the polls suggest that there has been some damage. I mean, it's obviously too early to say if there's going to be any sort of like profound lasting damage. But I think that like the Conservatives have often sort of operated on the assumption that at some point these scandals are going to reach a kind of critical mass, and at that point, like, you know, Trudeau is finally going to be done for. You know, either he'll have to resign, or he'll be, you know, deposed by his party, or he'll lose the next election or something like that. And I mean, that doesn't seem like it's happened so far. That's not to say that it's impossible it could ever happen. But I do think that like part of the brand of the Liberal Party is that there is some degree of sort of expectation of scandal sort of baked into it. And that's sort of like a terrible thing to say, and it's sort of a cynical thing to say. But I do think that like on some respects, this is part of the price of admission, and this is part of what you sign up for when you vote Liberal. And you get a lot of, you know, things that in the eyes of Liberal voters are a price worth paying for this kind of sort of petty corruption that I think the We scandal and that the Lavalin scandal and the Aga Khan scandal and all these sorts of things, like they're all sort of part of a similar sort of ball of corruption that is, I think, very identifiably of the Liberal Party and of a kind of you know, entitlement and sort of elitism that is very familiar to, I think, people like me that have been watching politics for a while now.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm generally much more bullish on Trudeau's chances overall. I think that he has proven himself to be quite a sort of Teflon character, and a person who, you know, I think that the strategy, frankly, that his people are running is not an irrational one, which is just to try to wait out things, right, and to not sort of fall for the hysteria of the moment. I do think the Conservatives tend to ratchet up their rhetoric extremely high. I think even the media does this to a large degree. But I think that time and time again, Trudeau and sort of the team around him have proven that, you know, if you do sort of few gestures, you know, Morneau has now been fired, and there's always, just like how Gerald Butts was fired before, like there's always people that you can kind of throw under the bus to make it seem like you've learned some degree of lesson and then move on. And I think that, I think that there's no reason to believe that this will necessarily be any different.
Gotcha. Yeah. So Derek Sloan, we mentioned him. He's one of the candidates for the CBC nomination. And he says on his website that he will, quote, make federal grants to universities conditional upon proof that all recipients respect free speech and free inquiry on campus. I guess my question would be, how do you feel about these kinds of policies as a way to uphold free speech in Canada?
I think that this is an example of where if you're running for leadership, theoretically running for prime minister, you have to sort of be able to gussy up the base in some regard and sort of hit these kind of hot button issues that are very big in sort of conservative media world right now and sort of the conservative base in general. But I do think that a policy like that shows the limitations of the degree that the federal government can really do much of anything to address what is fundamentally a problem of culture, right? It's a problem that's like the lack of sort of free speech or the lack of sort of what is the word? Sort of like the lack of sort of positive reception or the lack of there sort of being a sort of welcoming environment for a diversity of opinions, for opinions on the right, which is sort of what this is obviously a proxy for.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a symptom of, problems with the sort of people that wind up as professors, problems with the sort of people that wind up in control of the student governments and the student spaces, and student administrators and all this kind of thing. Like, it's a very broad-based sort of cultural problem that the federal government is not going to correct through some sort of funding, initiative one way or another. So I think that, in some respects, that's a very sort of classically conservative point that I'm trying to make here, which is that not all problems have a government solution, right? And I think that there is sometimes a temptation among conservative politicians, who by definition have to sort of rationalize their own existence and rationalize their own careers, into championing policies that I think they know on some level will not be effective in delivering the goods. I think that if conservatives are worried about a lack of free speech on campus, they have to do basically the sorts of things that you guys do, right? Engage in on-campus activism and sort of start at the grassroots level. I don't think folks like you, when you get up in the morning, you think like the big problem here is that the federal government isn't, funding policy is not where it needs to be, right? Yeah. So like I understand what he's doing is a sort of game of politics, but I don't think that this is like anywhere within like the top 10 root causes of why campuses have become so inhospitable to conservatives.
Yeah, so you hit the nail right on the head for me at least, because when I see a policy like this, it just doesn't seem like a inherently conservative thing to do, where you have the federal government dictating values onto people, and that just never seems to work out historically in general. If you were to just think about how it would even be implemented, like I guess someone would set up federal agencies and send inspectors to every campus and figure out how much free speech is supported. Because let's be honest, like the only way they can really measure the amount of free speech isn't by their code of ethics or anything, because every university campus, including UBC here, in their code, they support free speech. They ostensibly support free speech, but what you really want to see is their actions, whether or not they cancel people, they prevent people from talking and whatnot. Yes. And obviously that's something that just a federal government, it just seems weird that we would have, even ideas about kind of controlling that.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Yeah. I want to talk about the federal deficit because, coronavirus has really impacted everyone here, and Trudeau is nonstop printing money. Mm-hmm. And this year's federal deficit is basically projected to reach $256 billion, meaning that the total national debt in total will be over $1.1 trillion. So regardless of who wins the nomination in the Conservative Party, all four candidates have pledged to reduce their spending in various social programs in some way or another. But the problem that I see when it comes to conservatives on this issue is that deficit spending for the average voter, they don't seem to feel the negative impact in terms of how much money the federal government prints or spends. But at the same time, when you try to reduce spending on certain social programs, voters, they do have a meaningful impact on their lives.
Yes.
And obviously what ends up happening is that basically being fiscally responsible, talking about reducing spending, ends up being more often than not, a political loser. And this has basically resulted in a lot of conservative parties, not even just in Canada, but around the world, where they're deciding between the path of either doing something that is good politically, but overall probably bad for the country in the long term, or something that is bad politically, but overall good for the country in the long term. And a good example of this would be down south. We can see that the Republicans, especially under Trump these days, has really taken a clear decision to go to one of these two paths, where nowadays, the past 2 decades, there really hasn't been any substantial change between the Democrats and Republicans, maybe in different types of spending, but generally speaking, the deficit has grown year after year pretty consistently. I guess my question would be, facing this problem, is the Conservative Party of Canada destined to the same fate as the Republicans?
Yeah, I would think so. And Trump is a sort of like interesting example, because not only have the Republicans like shown a marked disinterest in reducing debt and deficit in the way that they made such a big deal of under the Obama administration, is that you now sort of have this whole faction of conservatives that actually argue that there's something heroic about the fact that Trump has been so profoundly disinterested in doing things like entitlement reform that previously, conservative politicians like Paul Ryan had made their sort of champion cause. I was just listening to a podcast as I walked up here with some sort of, prominent sort of Trump-supporting conservative intellectuals who were sort of like scorning and shunning, like the what they would call like the Romney-Ryan sort of philosophy, where it's just like tax cuts and cutting social programs, and like the Trump is some sort of like great sort of populist hero because he's championing these popular social programs like Medicare and Social Security with no plan whatsoever to reform them in any way to make them financially viable in the long term. But this is not the kind of politics that I think is worth celebrating, because it's the easiest thing in the world, right? It's the easiest thing in the world to keep taxes low and spending high, and to just kind of say like, oh, it's somebody else's problem, and the only people that have a problem with it are these kind of like, people that are just obsessed with numbers for their own sake, or, kind of like miserly, wicked people who just want to cut things and, put grandma out on the street and that kind of thing. It does sort of seem to me like, I'm 36 now, so it's like I've seen these debates kind of come and go a little bit more, which is a cool thing about getting older, is that you kind of have just more context in which to sort of evaluate these things. And what it seems to me is that the only way that any effort is ever really taken to sort of get spending under control and get entitlement programs sort of reined in is if the nation is at some sort of crisis point to the degree that there becomes a sort of like bipartisan consensus that something needs to be done, right? When you study the history of this country, you learn that sort of in the 1990s, that was the moment in which it happened, right? Like that this was the time in which, our credit rating was going down, and we were sort of being mocked internationally. The famous line that everybody learns is, I think it was the Wall Street Journal that called us like an honorary member of the third world because our debt was getting so severe. But then what happened was that you had, obviously the right-wing party said this is a huge crisis, but then you had the Liberal Party under Prime Minister Chrétien and Finance Minister Paul Martin, who were sufficiently spooked by these numbers as well that they agreed to make significant cuts in things like welfare and spending in general, to unload more of the spending responsibilities onto the provinces and that sort of thing. And so like that was sort of like the last great moment in which there was actually an effort to sort of tackle debt and deficit as an issue, and it resulted in balanced budgets and all sorts of good things for Canada, at least in the short term. But lacking that kind of bipartisan consensus, what you wind up getting instead is exactly, I think, the sort of thing that you sort of alluded to, where you get like a left-wing party that's in power and they raise spending, and you get a right-wing party that's in power and they cut taxes, and it just becomes this terrible cycle. And then if the right-wing party proceeds to try to cut spending after, the spend-happy left-wing party's out of power, well, then the left-wing parties mobilize, all of their activists, the unions, and, various people that are very reliant on government funding, and they do the sob stories, and it gets very broadcast in the press about how the evil conservatives are cutting spending for all these like cruel ideological reasons. We saw some of this with the Harper government. We saw some of this, I remember, I'm old enough to remember when Premier Campbell was elected in this province, and some of the spending cuts he made and how that was so demonized. And then what happens is that a lot of conservatives don't really have the courage to fight this battle because it becomes such a PR disaster at some point that you have to back away, and then as a result, the nation's finances are not really fixed in any lasting way. Maybe they'll make a few tweaks here. They'll cut some sort of very high-profile, stupid thing that conservatives can all agree is dumb. Subsidies for porn movies or something, right? And I remember the conservative government under Stephen Harper literally did that, and this was like very celebrated because it's symbolic, right? Yeah. But the biggest thing, like when you're wanting to actually get the finances, the budgeting under control, you have to go after popular, widely used, broad-based, middle-class, friendly social programs. And that's the one thing that just no one wants to do because it's so politically toxic. So, I mean, this just really seems like it's one of the perennial themes of government, and I don't really know how you ever break the cycle.
I see. So, Joe Biden has recently picked Kamala to be his VP, and I guess just the very first question is, what are your general thoughts on this decision? What are your thoughts about her and Joe Biden?
I think that Biden made the right pick in picking her, in the sense that she was very consistent with the strategy that he's been pursuing so far, right? So Biden seems very content for this election to be a referendum on President Trump, right? So like the front of mind issue for every single American voter is not about Biden, it's about Trump, yes or no. Yeah. And Biden has run a very low-key campaign. The Republicans sort of scorn it as like he's in his basement, he's sort of never seen in public and this kind of thing, and that's true to an extent. But I think it's not so much a symptom of the idea that Biden can't campaign. It's a symptom of that, like, Biden will do good so long as this becomes very clearly a sort of binary choice on Trump himself, as opposed to a sort of competing vision kind of thing, which I don't really think is the contest that Biden's interested in running, or even necessarily the sort of contest that a politician like Biden is particularly well suited for. I don't think that, like, Biden's vision for America is necessarily something that is sort of broadly resonant or even coherent, right? But so that being said, by picking Kamala Harris, a politician who's already very well known and already sort of like a very mainstream person, she was already been thoroughly vetted by the media and by the opposition and all the rest of it. By picking her, he basically ensured that what is normally a very sort of splashy and exciting news event would be incredibly short-lived, because there's just not that much to say. Right. It's like Kamala Harris, the politician that we all know, the politician that, ran for president, we all know her biography inside out at this point, right? So by picking her, as opposed to picking some other person, he's guaranteed that the media cycle focus on her would be extremely short, and that immediately Trump would just go back to being the dominant figure in the day-to-day news cycle. So I think that that was a very wise move. I mean, from purely sort of strategic perspective. In the longer term, it's a very interesting move. I was reading a piece the other day that said it could be easily the most consequential decision that Biden has made in recent decades, just in the sense that win or lose, Kamala Harris is now sort of crowned as the next in line, right? Yeah. And so that's like an enormously sort of significant thing, is that he has sort of given her this sort of aura that she'll now carry with her for quite a while to come. And however she chooses to handle that, is the ball sort of in her court, whether it's as vice president or whether it's as the former vice presidential candidate who will now sort of be a perceived frontrunner for 2024. And the fact that she's already in the Senate too means that she'll have if Trump gets reelected, she'll have a very prominent podium to sort of launch critiques of him in his second term. So I think it's a very interesting choice, and I think it was probably the right choice.
Similarly, in one of your videos, this must have been over a year ago, you mentioned that your prediction for the 2020 election would be that Trump would probably win re-election. Obviously, a lot has changed since then. Ever since the start of 2020, we have the pandemic, we have George Floyd, we have just the economic downturn in general. Given all that, after everything, and it's crazy to say that we're only 3 months away from the election, less than that actually, then is your prediction for Trump winning the same? Do you have any doubts?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have a lot more doubts now than I did initially. I mean, I think it's the interesting thing about this election is that so many people on both the right and the left were so traumatized by 2016, like that their brains were just so thoroughly scrambled and wrecked by it, that it's made people like just constantly like very nervous and very cautious about making firm predictions, which I think is, that's generally a good disposition to have in life. But I think that being said, at some point you do kind of have to bend to reality, and obviously things can change and the polls can change, but the polls have been so consistently in one direction for so long at this point. Biden having a very substantial lead, a bigger lead than Hillary Clinton, and, and all this kind of stuff, and and in the swing states and all the rest of it. And so, like, at some point you just kind of have to resign to reality and just kind of say, like, I have no reason to suspect that Trump could get back in with all things being equal, like all things sort of continuing the way that they are. I initially thought that maybe Trump would get a bit of a boost from the coronavirus thing, that, he would provide a sort of model of leadership that people would rally behind. That obviously has not happened. Just the opposite. In fact, I think this has been a huge net, liability for him. So I think that, and the George Floyd protests, I mean, that is, I think, a little bit more of a question mark in the long term, because I think, like, initially, when it was still very identifiably about George Floyd, you could say that the polls all suggested that most of America was ready to have that conversation about Black Lives Matter and be sympathetic and that kind of thing. The longer it goes on, and sort of like the more it becomes sort of detached from George Floyd, and it just becomes sort of these weird pictures you see out of Portland that just sort of seem like it's its own kind of self-moving thing. Like, maybe that might help Trump a little bit more, like the sort of law and order president kind of thing. But the thing is that it's just like, so much of it just comes down to Trump. And like, Trump is just a deeply, deeply unpopular person. And like, most Americans just do not like him. They turn on the television, they see his face, he just has like a grating obnoxiousness to him. And it's like, that is just very, very difficult to get beyond, right? Like, he's been president for 4 years. People know what they're getting for him. So the idea that he's ever going to be able to effectively market himself as any sort of like credible leader, like, I just kind of think like that ship has sailed. Now, there is obviously possible that sort of lightning could strike twice, and that, Biden could somehow become much more unpopular than he is, and that Trump could sort of sneak out some incredibly narrow victory in the Electoral College, while Biden would presumably win by an even bigger margin in the popular vote than Hillary Clinton did. But, I mean, obviously anything can happen, but like, again, like at some point you kind of just have to be calm and rational about these kinds of things and say, like, I have no reason to believe this, but I have every reason to believe that.
Right, of course. So your prediction from now
My prediction would be that he would lose,
Yeah, gotcha. All right, well, let's talk about something closer to home, because we're both in Vancouver here, and Meng Wanzhou, as you know, is very close to home, where, for those of you who don't know, Meng is the CFO for Huawei, and in 2018, she was arrested here at our airport under the request by U.S. authorities on the suspicion that she somehow violated U.S. sanctions against Iran. And essentially, since then, she's been here. There's been a kind of tug of war between the two great economies that we deal with, the U.S. and China, where the United States wants her to be extradited back to their country, and the Chinese want us to kind of just release her. And obviously, relations with both countries, especially the Chinese, are under severe threat depending on the outcome of the court decision. And I guess, what would you want to see as the outcome?
I mean, I think that basically the path that we're on right now strikes me as the correct one. Like, I mean, I think she should be extradited to the U.S. I mean, I think that the U.S. sort of legal system should continue on its merry way. I mean, from my perspective, like, I don't come at this from the idea that America and China are sort of like equally important allies of Canada. Like, I think the United States is just objectively so much more important, both just in a practical sense, like the economic relationship and the diplomatic and the cultural relationship, like that is Canada's allies, is the US. We are obviously so deeply integrated. A lot of people in this country don't like America and don't like the fact that Canada is as dependent on America as it is. And so as a result, like over the last 20 years or so, they've sort of been pumping up China as like the great alternative to America. Like the country that Canada should get closer to, in part to wean ourselves off America, which is this sort of like perennial obsession of sort of the Canadian political class going back to the founding of this country. And I've just never been partial to that idea, right? Like, I'm much more of a sort of hawk on China, where I sort of see their rise as as a bad thing. I see them as the kind of like successor to the Soviet Union in the sense that they represent a geopolitical and ideological and strategic threat, not only to Canada, but to sort of the wider world, and that it's sort of a time for choosing and that you should be firmly on one side or another. So I don't necessarily see that this is a relationship that's worth bending over backwards to salvage in the way that, you know, I don't know if you saw that letter, the open letter that was written by various Canadian big shots, you know, former cabinet ministers and chief justices of, you know, this and that. And you know, they were all sort of saying like, this relationship is so important that we should really just, you know, send her back to China and just sort of be done with this, because like this is getting out of control and Canada can't handle the damage to this relationship. But I think we can handle the damage to this relationship, and it's not something that really stresses me out too much, because I really do think that like I'm a very sort of America first kind of Canadian, where I just think like that relationship is fundamentally the one that is worth preserving. And I think that I think that like so much of the discourse about China in this country exists in the context of that uniquely Canadian anxiety about being too dependent on the US.
Right.
And if you don't have that anxiety, as I don't, then it's much harder to sort of view the Chinese regime as anything but what it is, which is, I think, you know, a sort of wicked dictatorship with values vastly different than our own, and thus not any sort of natural ally in any sort of context.
What do you think of the argument, though, that the ramifications of upsetting China are far more severe and far more dangerous than the ramifications of upsetting the US when it comes to this Meng case, where if we were to release her, you know, realistically, the US, they're not like China, they're not just going to cut off trade with what we do, but China very well may cut off a bunch of what they do with us economically, and that would have pretty devastating impacts on Canada. What do you think about that kind of scale?
I think that if that was to happen, the damage that China would get from its, like the damage to China's reputation that would occur in the aftermath, like for China to be seen as being that vindictive to a country like ours, to a country like Canada that has such a sort of positive, sorry, I'm going to sneeze. Sorry.
Wait, we'll use this opportunity to close this door.
Bless you.
Sorry. No, for that, like the damage that I think would happen to China's reputation in that context, if China was being seen as like irrationally bullying a country like Canada, a country with such a positive reputation, like I think that would be, I don't know, I'm just not personally convinced that China would play that card, that China would be willing to sort of take that risk and sort of deal with the backlash that it would get from America, from sort of the broader Western world, and the degree to which that Canada would just overwhelmingly emerge as the sympathetic party in such a conflict, right? I think that China talks a big game on a lot of these issues, but I'm sort of willing to call their bluff on some of this stuff, and I don't know if that, you know, will strike some people as kind of, you know, as dangerous or as irresponsible, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert in foreign policy. I can just sort of come at what I view to be the motives of the people that are pushing in a domestic context one option or the other. And I see a lot more of this being the people that are sort of pushing for, you know, there to be some sort of negotiated settlement to this. I see it as much more being driven by a faction within this country that wants to preserve a positive relationship with China because that is seen as an objective good, not because that they're worried about the negative consequences, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, gotcha. So, in a 2016 video with Adam in your series Gay by Gay,
oh, yes.
By the way, I'm curious why it stopped, like what happened?
Oh, we're just both busy, you know, like we're on to other things. Actually, I think the official reason why it stopped was that I moved to Toronto briefly, and I think like we just didn't in proxy. But I mean, like I still like Adam. We're still on good terms. But
That's
you know,
good. That's good.
We're busy people.
Right.
My YouTube channel is a lot.
Oh yeah, for sure. So anyways, in that video in 2016, you mentioned this was a topic about marijuana, and you mentioned your opposition to the legalization of marijuana.
Yes.
Fast forward 2 years in 2018, that's when Trudeau officially legalized marijuana, and fast forward now 2 years later, I guess my question would be, what do you think the impact of this legalization, how do you think it impacted Canada and Canadians, and is your position against legalization still the same?
Yeah, I mean, I still do broadly oppose the legal status of marijuana. I mean, I think that the legislation that Trudeau passed is interesting because like so much legislation that is passed by Parliament these days, it basically just gives unchecked power to the executive branch to basically regulate marijuana any way it wants going forward. So like if I ever became Prime Minister, and God willing, one day I will, I could really just like prohibit it overnight, right? So it's like, so I mean, I suppose in some respect that's a kind of victory, because it has really sort of shown that Trudeau is not willing to go the full sort of libertarian thing, you know, like people have, I've seen some libertarians say that like in a just society, marijuana would be like geraniums, right? Like it's just a sort of generic consumer product, but it's clearly not being treated that way, which I think reflects the fact that even a liberal like Trudeau understands that there still are a lot of questions about this drug. There's still a lot of questions about its health effects. There's questions about sort of like the social consequences that comes from normalizing one more drug. You look at a lot of the regulatory powers that Trudeau has used so far that he's given himself, and you know they've been to impose, you know, like plain packaging, and you know you see the storefront windows with all the, you know, the frosting on it so you can't look in, like all this kind of stuff. Like that's, you know, I'm very hesitant to give Trudeau any credit at all for this because it's something that I've opposed for so long. But I do think that the idea that even people on the left are really viewing this with a great deal of caution and a great deal of skepticism. And I'm worried, frankly, that I think that this could come back to haunt them. You know, I think that there are some analogies to the way that cigarettes sort of played out in our society. Because people forget just how recent the concept of smoking tobacco as a commercial product is. It's like a completely 20th century phenomenon. And it went through a very clear rise and fall. Like it went from being a kind of like glamorous kind of cool thing that everybody did and was very aggressively marketed and was the same sort of thing, like was a very sort of sign of your status as a sort of liberated man or woman. You know, you're not letting people tell you what to do, you're kind of cool and countercultural and all this kind of stuff. You know, it went through that phase, and then eventually we started learning about the health consequences of it, and we realized that there was a lot of people that were frankly merchants of death who were selling this deeply harmful and destructive product in order to make a lot of money for themselves, and suppressing a lot of the evidence and suppressing a lot of the research about the negative health consequences. And then eventually, of course, you know, within my own lifetime, it became this hugely taboo product that was unacceptable to market in any sort of way. It became unacceptable to ingest in a sort of public context. And now it's been largely eradicated, certainly among my generation, your generation, and the generation behind us. So I often wonder if like marijuana is destined to go in a sort of similar path. And I think it's kind of weird and kind of an incongruous sort of moment that we're in, where it's like on the one hand we're legalizing it, but on the other hand we're like simultaneously trying to sort of smother it in the cradle at the same time. So I don't know, like I just feel like in general government policy regarding marijuana is very confused and is sort of like still a little bit frozen in the kind of norms and assumptions of like a generation prior. So it's, I don't know, it's being pulled in a lot of different directions, but I would not be surprised at all if the long-term consequence is that the ratchet continues to get sort of tightened, and that we kind of, it goes through a kind of hump where there is sort of like prohibition, brief window of legalization, and then a new sort of prohibition again. And I think that it'll be very interesting to see if the Conservative government ever gets elected in this country, or even, you know, in the provinces and stuff, if you start to see that there becomes a lot of demand for the government to use these very severe regulatory powers it's given itself to really sort of just continue to tighten rather than loosen, which is I think what a lot of the activists assumed was going to be the inevitable case.
Yeah, for sure. One of the many unspoken issues that you've talked about and that you're infamous for is the bilingualism debate within government and society in general. So we obviously came a long way historically from the days of Upper and Lower Canada, where half the population spoke French, half spoke English. Today, just to give you folks some context here, other than Quebec and New Brunswick, because of their sizable Acadian population, every other province and territory has French speakers at less than 5% of the total population. So to put that in context, here in BC, about 12% of people here are Chinese, 7% are Indian. So that Chinese people literally outnumber Francophones almost 10 to 1. And I'm not even saying that necessarily I'm in favor of having Mandarin being written alongside English in all food packaging. But at the very least, you know, it would make more sense, at least in BC, for that to happen, or Hindi for that moment. it would multiply the benefits multiple fold. So I guess the question would be, how is this not being discussed? How are we not talking about it? French speakers here are around 1.5% of the population in BC. How is this not even? Why is this so taboo?
No, I mean it's a very good argument, and in some respects that's sort of like the forbidden argument. The argument in terms of specifically the one that you made, where it's sort of, and as long as I've been alive, I've always heard sort of just people on the street, never the politicians, but people on the street make that argument all the time. Why French? Why not, Chinese? Why not Hindi or whatever, right? Punjab, it's like, what is the utilitarian argument? But of course, Ottawa does not want you to think about this in terms of utilitarianism, right? They want you to think about this in terms of a kind of like nationalistic, patriotic myth about the country, which is that the country has always been French and English, and so too it must always be, right? And it's a very outdated and very sort of weird argument, particularly in this kind of like multicultural, sort of diverse, dare I even say sort of postmodern time that we're in right now, which is I think very against the idea that there should be any sort of like hierarchy of cultures in determining, sort of the character of the country or the policies that we pursue. The idea that, that French and English Canadians are somehow at the top of the pyramid and that they should sort of be able to shape the country in the form of their own culture, and that, other cultures should sort of be subordinate within that pyramid. It's very strange, and I've argued and I've debated this issue so many times with so many people, and it's striking to me just how often pro-bilingualism people, when confronted with sort of the blunt reality arguments, they're not persuasive arguments at all, they're just kind of blunt appeals to authority, right? Like you guys know all about logical fallacies and this sort of thing, right? Yeah. When it comes down to just like this kind of blunt appeal, like this is what it says, ergo I win the argument, like it's just deeply unpersuasive. And I think it's very important, now that we're in a moment where we're talking about things like, systemic racism and all these kinds of things, it's very important to, I think, reevaluate some of these dated assumptions about the kind of country that Canada is, and some of our sort of patriotic mythologies about who this country is for and what kind of people inhabit it, and how public policy should be accommodating to these assumed, demographic realities. And so I mean, I think it's sort of long overdue to reevaluate a lot of this stuff using a little bit more utilitarian logic. Like America, for example, does not have official languages at all, and they just have a very much more sort of pragmatic attitude. When you go to the States, you'll see, like, just depending on what community you're in, you'll see more or less, packaging or billboards.
Like Arizona, Texas, you see Spanish.
Yeah, you see so much in the southern U.S. You see so much Spanish used in public. I remember when I was in Miami, it's just like everywhere, and it's like that's not a national policy. Right. Because it would be absurd as a national policy. Like, there's plenty of states where there's not a lot of Spanish spoken. There might be other languages spoken instead. But when it comes to language policy, like, I very much come at this from the belief that, like, language is fundamentally a tool of communication. And thus public policy has to have as its primary focus, will this help or hinder the effective communication of the public? Their ability to communicate with each other, to communicate with the government, right? And I just see no sign that official French-English bilingualism, even though it was very much introduced to the public as something that fundamentally had efficiency of communication as its primary purpose, I see no evidence that that's what is rationalizing its existence in the present. I see it much more as just kind of a way for a certain bilingual ruling class to preserve their power in the federal government and elsewhere.
Right. Speaking on that, you touched on the political ramifications, which I didn't even mention, but it's so true. Where and it's probably the most important thing, because food packaging labels, we can kind of maybe ignore that in general. But you mentioned very correctly in your videos that it's either going to be people growing up in Quebec or wealthy families who either had inherent connections in politics or, like a long-term goal for politics. And Trudeau's a very good example of that. So with that being said, clearly, if you only have these two demographics and maybe like some rare people outside of that, and you don't encompass everyone else, that essentially shuts out everyone else in terms of the chance of being able to lead this country, which I would say is probably an injustice being done, because there's nothing that the other demographics have done wrong for that.
No, it's like
So-
if I can give you like a very good example, like take Leslie Lewis, right?
Yeah.
Like I have my political differences with her, but like there's no denying that like she's an accomplished, successful, intelligent woman. You know, she immigrated to this country as a very small child with her family from the Caribbean. You know, and she sort of, I assume, probably was not a family of great means. Black immigrant family, you know, in Toronto, lots of hardships and structural barriers and whatnot. But, you know, she rose through the ranks, you know, studied, learned, became an accomplished lawyer, you know, passed the bar and worked in a number of high-profile businesses. It seems to me that there's something fundamentally unjust about a society that then turns to that person and says, like, close but wrong, you didn't learn French, therefore you have no business, you know, in our halls of power, right? Like, that to me is really a form of systemic oppression. And I think we should be much more explicit in recognizing it as such, because so long as we have these arbitrary barriers, there's no reason for her to have ever picked up the French language. It has in no respects been useful for her life. And to demand that be, you know, the price of entry into the political elite, I think it's very difficult to argue that Canada is a true meritocracy or even a true democracy as long as you have barriers like that prevent sort of ascension.
Yeah, because especially using BC as a good example, so many immigrant families, you're not going to be learning French and speaking it fluently here because nobody really speaks it here. And when you already have your native tongue and then you're learning English, unless you're like some high IQ genius, you're not going to be able to be fluent in maybe a third language, especially if you come here pretty late in that.
Yeah, and I mean, it's worth saying, like, why do we not see more, like, you know, Chinese Canadians in high positions of power and this kind of thing? Why have there never been, like, an Asian person on the Supreme Court of Canada, for instance, right? Like, it's very clear that a lot of these things go back, if you look for the study, or if you sort of look at the explanations, oftentimes it does explicitly come down to, well, you know, they didn't have the language skills.
Right. So do you see any future, any world where this can somehow be fixed, where we can kind of change that, or even begin to talk about it?
Well, I mean, I think it requires a lot of political will, frankly. I mean, you have bilingualism in the Charter of Rights. In fact, one weird thing about the Charter of Rights is that it gives vastly more space to bilingualism rights, as it is construed, than it does to almost any other human right in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the bilingualism rights are also protected to a much greater extent than even basic human rights like freedom of speech are, which is, I think, a depressing reality of our constitutional system. But that being said, there is clearly like a lot of things that a determined government in Ottawa could do. You know, like the Office of the Language Commissioner, the Commissioner of Official Languages, like that, in my mind, is just a position that we should just get rid of and, you know, certainly scale back all the degrees that there's sort of bilingualism enforcement bureaucracies in every department of the federal government that have as its sort of defining purpose the spread and promulgation of the two official languages. I just would really sort of take a cleaver to all of that kind of thing. I mean, beyond that, I think the other thing that you have to do is just be comfortable promoting a truly sort of meritocratic sort of system in which you make it very explicit that you're hiring the best people for the job, not on the basis of their language skills, which is the exact opposite of what Ottawa has been doing, and all parties have been complicit in this. You know, during the Harper years, Parliament repeatedly passed, by unanimous votes, you know, regulations requiring more and more top jobs in the federal government to be exclusively reserved for French-English bilinguals at the time of appointment, which is a stipulation that they didn't even used to use. They used to say, well, like, if you're making a good faith effort to learn, well, that's good enough. But now they say, like, well, you have to be fluent at the time of appointment. And so, like, I would just, you know, rescind a lot of that kind of stuff. And I would also sort of say, like, I'm not going to do what Trudeau did, for instance, and say that every single Supreme Court justice has to be bilingual and only from, you know, give them the time of day.
Yeah.
So I think the idea of getting rid of official bilingualism is certainly a high hill to climb given its constitutional status. But there's certainly nothing to say that you have to take it as seriously as our successive governments in Ottawa have chosen to take it.
Right. So moving on, I want to talk about your YouTube channel because honestly, you know, as you know, I'm a big fan of your channel and the work that you've done. One of the most fascinating things that I find about your channel is that it's very much the opposite of many other channels that I follow. And what I mean by that is you talk about the broadest of issues, such as conservatism, to some of the narrowest subjects, like why we give apples to teachers, for instance, right? And it's one of the coolest things where you have such a wide array of the videos that you make, but at the same time, what's perhaps even more unique, and I would say it's a strong sign of your conscientiousness, where you have managed to put out a video every single week for the past half decade, if I recall. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It's certainly getting close to there. I think I've taken the occasional week off when something's sort of come off, but I try to do it every single Saturday for several years.
Yeah, which is insane to me, because most, as I mentioned, this is the exact opposite with a lot of other philosophies of other channels, where they tend to skew pretty narrow in the range of videos that they produce, and at the same time their scheduling is just whack. It's just like they whenever they can, they would just make a video. But your schedule is consistent, but then your range is very wide. I was just wondering, was this a deliberate decision that you made? Was this a reflection of who you are?
Well, thank you. That's very flattering, all the compliments you gave me. I think, my background is in journalism, right? That's doing political commentary, before that doing political cartoons. I've always just been somebody that really operates on a production cycle of, you do something at a set time every week or whatever, right? Like whether you're drawing your cartoon, you release it on this day, you're writing your column, you release it on that day. When I did television, it's the same thing, like, you go on TV, your slot is at this moment. So I guess I've always just been somebody that just works well in a schedule, in a very sort of structured environment. That's probably just something about me as a person. I sometimes second guess it a bit, because I am, my for all the praise you gave me, my channel is not that popular, right? Like, I'm 200,000 subscribers, which seems impressive to some people, but like within the YouTube context, where you have so many people that have 500,000, 1 million plus subscribers, it's not that many. So I do sometimes wonder if maybe this kind of cycle is not necessarily the right approach, and that maybe, pausing a bit and putting more time into a more substantial video might be a little bit better than just churning out whatever every week. I don't know.
So all these topics that you talk about, to me, I'm interested in history, I'm interested in politics. Pretty much every kind of video that you would release, I would be watching it. I'm just wondering what's your secret to that? Like, how do you get, such consistent, interesting topics every single week?
Well, I don't know. I guess I'm just interested in a lot of stuff, right? And and that's part of the good thing about being older too, as well, is that you've just accumulated a lot of knowledge on stuff. I usually don't make videos that are on topics I know nothing about, or that I'm going in completely cold. So I usually just kind of always have ideas that are sort of in the back of my head, or sort of things that I've been interested in over the years. I was saying, I'm always thinking, there's always sort of stuff in the back of my head that I've always just sort of been thinking about over the years, and I just kind of feel like, this could make a good video someday.
You write it down, you kind of...
I don't even necessarily... I actually put a lot less thought into it than I'm even making it sound right now. Like, usually, I was talking about this with somebody yesterday, it's like, when do you sort of plan your next video? Well, it's usually like when I'm about halfway through whatever the current video is. Like, something just kind of like occurs to me, and just kind of like, sometimes the process of working on a video brings new ideas to the forefront, and you just kind of go from there. So, there's not that much effort that goes into it. The other thing too is that you think about like what your audience is interested in. Right. I've been doing this for so long that I'm starting to get a pretty good sense of like what my audience is. Like I have a sort of like idea. I often make videos that are sort of like, what would I have liked to watch, like, I don't know, like maybe 10 years ago? Because it's like my audience is generally like a bit younger than me. Yep. So I try to think of it like, well, what were things that were appealing to sort of like younger JJ, and then sort of engage with those topics. Because I think that's very important if you're going to be successful in the medium of YouTube, is to always have a lot of respect, but also like to really sort of identify strongly with your audience, and to sort of have a sense of what they're looking to get out of your channel. And because like I'm not a compelling enough personality on my own that people are just signing up just for me, just to spend time with JJ, they also want to sort of get something out of that experience. And so I think sort of just being sensitive to why they're subscribers in the first place, and sort of delivering content that that sort of furders their little educational adventure.
Right. Yeah, that's good, because I can safely say that your community, they love to learn from you and all the work that you put out. Speaking of your community, I actually want to conclude basically with a lightning round where I have 15 questions, and several of them actually came directly from your Discord community. I have them credited as well. So whenever you're ready.
All right, let's try.
All right, let's go. Should the British monarchy be abolished?
Yes.
By the way, you can feel free to pause and elaborate on these points if you think that they're controversial. All right, let's keep going. Political Outcast asks, who's your favorite American president?
Probably Washington, I think.
Is there a God?
Yes.
Should vaccinations be mandatory?
I think it depends on what you're vaccinating for, but I think in general, yes.
Let's take the COVID, for instance.
Yeah, I think that should be mandatory.
Okay.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the proposed SkyTrain system to UBC? And Kim Il-sung wants to know what you think about railway systems in general.
I mean, I love the SkyTrain, frankly. I use it like almost exclusively. I can drive, but I never drive. So I'm very pro SkyTrain. I think it should go all over the Lower Mainland.
That's good. And SkyTrains in general?
Yeah,
railway systems.
I mean, just because I'm so dependent on the SkyTrain here, I love whenever I go to another city that they have something SkyTrain.
Right.
I hate having to like learn, some new bus system or even Ubering. Like I don't like doing it. I like going on, public transportation in a rail form as much as possible.
That's good, yeah. Bus systems can be scattered everywhere, yeah, it's crazy. What is your favorite type of video to make?
My favorite type of video to make? Oh, that's a good question. I like making long videos that are kind of a deep dive into a topic. Those are also the hardest and most sort of time consuming to make.
Yeah.
Some of the videos that I'm most proud of, and the ones that people compliment me on and that I feel the most pride for when they do, is probably like some of the videos that I've made about the Prime Ministers of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I've done 3 videos on those. I'm very proud of those. And I've made a couple of videos that are just a kind of like really deep dive. So I made a video on recycling that I'm very proud of. And I recently made a video about sort of the Christian right that I'm quite proud of as well. So those kind of things. I mean, it's not to say that sort of like these more lighthearted videos where I just kind of like do a quick survey of a bunch of different topics are not satisfying as well, but those are the ones that I feel like I'm most proud of.
That's good to hear, yeah. Apex AU asks, how's your wife and 5 kids doing?
Oh, they're fine.
Do you want to explain to...
That's just kind of a running joke on the
On
Discord,
the Discord,
right? I mean, like, that I have a wife and children, I don't know.
In Alberta somewhere.
It's just, I think it's funny when, I don't know, like, I feel like there's a lot of YouTubers, a lot of sort of people in the media, in sort of like the new age media, podcasters or whatever, who often make like a reference to like this off-camera life that they have, with like their children and their wives and that kind of thing. And I guess maybe like that's sort of like what started that running joke.
Like,
I was just kind of like, I sometimes feel like that I don't reveal enough of myself in my YouTube channel, but that's also because there's not really that much going on beyond my YouTube channel in my life. So I kind of like the idea like, oh, wouldn't it be fun if I had like this whole like other sort of side of me that you never get to see? But no, you don't. Because
That's
there
hilarious.
isn't anything.
Yeah. When does life begin?
When does life begin? Oh man, that's the question that Barack Obama said is above my pay grade. I don't know. I mean, I am broadly pro-life, if that's where this is sort of going.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that like life in the womb is clearly a form of life, and that we should have protections for it and that kind of thing. So I mean, exactly when that begins, I don't know. And I think that when it comes to abortion policy, I do think that it's possible to have some degree of good faith compromise in which you can achieve some degree of consensus and sort of say like a pregnancy beyond this point, the unborn child clearly deserves some sorts of protections.
Right.
I think that when you start from an absolutist position, when you sort of say that life begins at conception, period, I think it becomes very difficult to form any sort of good faith, compromise-driven sort of abortion policy, which I think if pro-life people want there to be any progress on this issue, I think they have to be willing to give and take a bit. So.
Yeah, baby steps.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, because, I mean, it's crazy how, just not to go off topic, but Canada, we have very few limitations when it
We
comes
have none, really,
Yeah.
at the federal level.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy. Was Iraq a mistake?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that obviously you would have to say that the Iraq War was, a kind of fiasco, right? Like that it ended so disastrously. I mean, it's a counterfactual though, because I don't think anybody could say that Iraq would be some shining beacon today if that invasion had never happened. I mean, who knows? So it's very difficult. I mean, it's very difficult to sort of speak confidently on that question, I think. I think that what I always come back to is just that I do think that the invasion of Iraq was was positively motivated. You know, I think it was motivated by a good faith effort to solve what was perceived to be a very legitimate problem at the time, which was this notion that unrest in the Middle East was the root cause of fundamentalist Islamic terrorism, and that if there could be some sort of democracy initiative in which sort of the countries could, through U.S. support and money and obviously military power, if that could sort of be a kind of incubator of a new sort of form of society in the Middle East, that maybe sort of this would be sort of a project with sort of broad repercussions for the good of the larger world. And so I think it's always important to remember that that was the underlying sort of motive here, and this wasn't just kind of a decision that was made frivolously or
maliciously.
Or maliciously,
yeah,
right? Exactly. Yeah. So like that's what, and I mean, I'm sort of defensive about this just because that was like the big issue when I was your age. Like when I was in college, like the debate over the Iraq War in 2003 was like the defining issue on campuses and in the media and all the rest of it. And so it was an argument that I was like very, very deeply involved in. And a debate, like I was very for the Iraq invasion and I argued very passionately in favor of it. So when people go over in today just kind of being very flippant, they're like, oh, it was a big mistake, right? Like I get a little...
There's a lot more nuance to that.
Yeah, and it's funny, just like the farther away you get from things, the more people just, I don't know, like they forget and they become disinterested in even learning, right? Like this is actually increasingly becoming a big pet cause of mine. You know, it's very fashionable to go around saying that, you know, the young people today, they don't know their history, right? Yeah. But I increasingly sort of think that we need to learn our history even like 10 years ago. And this goes for like adults and like older people as well as young people. Like if you want to learn more about history and if you want to learn more about the present through the experiences of the past, like just look at what people were talking about like as much as a decade ago and you'll learn a lot. And I often think that like if you're going to studying history, you should maybe even start in a kind of backwards way rather than starting at the beginning of time and working towards the present. Maybe we should start at the present and go backwards.
Arguably, those are the most relevant things to today.
I agree.
Yeah, exactly. Why is your YouTube link Wart Mamu?
I talked about this once in one of my Q&A videos, and it's just a long time ago. I mean, like I started my YouTube channel long before I started making YouTube videos. Like I just made it for some reason. I don't remember why. I guess there's probably a time where you had to have like a YouTube account to even log into YouTube or something. But at one time, like many 90s era kids, I had like a stupid handle that I used on my AOL Instant Messenger and things like that. And it was Wart Mamu, who is a character in Mario Brothers. Right. The boss of Super Mario Brothers 2 is Wart, and in Japan his name is Mamu. So that was the big epic story behind that. I'm disturbed to know that people are still somehow able to find that URL, which I had suppressed well.
You have some videos where it still links that.
Oh, so.
Yeah. A religious John asks, what's your favorite Canadian fairy tale or story?
I don't think there are any Canadian fairy tales or stories. There might be some French Canadian ones, but I am ignorant of those.
Right. I tried searching them up. I couldn't recognize them.
Well, because like there's no need for Canada to have them. I mean, like there's not that many American fairy tales either. I mean, like these are mostly from Europe and mostly from Germany and France, and they've just kind of made their way into North American culture and civilization. So that's fine.
Yeah. Trolley question: let 3 die or pull the lever to kill 1?
Oh, the trolley question.
Yeah.
What is regarded as being the correct answer to that question?
It's really a 50-50 thing, I think, depending on... I guess your view on it depends on whether you think inaction is the same as action. So if you were to willingly choose to let 3 people die when you could have saved them, is that the same as actually killing them?
I don't know. I'm not much of a philosopher, so I have a hard time dealing with these kinds of abstract.
Just on your instinct, there's no wrong or...
I don't know, like I feel like the instinct should always be to sort of save the maximum number of people in a utilitarian sort of way. So I guess that would be my instinct.
Sure. Yeah. Good answer. Yeah. Should nations with colonial artifacts return them to former colonies?
Yeah, I think that seems like a bit of a no-brainer to me.
It's pretty contentious these days.
It is contentious, but I mean, I guess because we don't really live in that sort of society, it's easier for us to be a little bit more indifferent to that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, when UBC you have the the Anthropology Museum, which is just packed with artifacts that have been taken from indigenous people over the years. But you know, that is sort of, since we all live on the same continent, that can be sort of co-managed in a way that can be acceptable to both parties.
Right.
Where it's in like these European countries, like when I was in London, and you just see how like, you know, these museums are just so full with things that they all took from Egypt and that kind of stuff, right? Like it's pretty striking.
Right.
And so I remember when I was there, like years ago, that was my first instinct. It's just like, this is a lot of stuff that you just took from somewhere else. Like it seems a little indefensible. But
Right. Will you ever run for MP?
I don't know, maybe someday when I'm older.
Older?
I don't know. Like I often sort of think about this, like maybe I would have a political career when I was like in my 40s or my 50s or my 60s, like when I'm a sort of older man and I'm a little bit more sort of set in my life and established and that kind of thing. I'm a little bit skeptical of people that run for office when they're really young. I just think it's like, I just see, I'm 36, right? So I'm getting closer to 40, and I just see just how much more I know about things. Like just how much, like, you know, not to be pretentious about this, but like I do feel like I'm a much wiser person than I was when I was 26. And that's kind of a cool feeling. And it's actually not upsetting to me to think, to like imagine myself being like 56 or 66 and sort of thinking that like I'll be just a much more wise and competent person, and thus probably more useful as a politician at that age than I would be right now when there's still so many things that I'm just struggling to figure out, not only about society and people and life, but like even within my own personal life and that. So
I see a lot of parallels with what you said about politicians and also people in academia. There's been some kind of talks about how much a real world experience do you need before you should be able to be a professor or teach, you know, full time basically. And a lot of people, they think that, you know, you definitely need to be at least maybe 40 until you maybe go into it. But there's so many people who are kind of like handcrafted into either academia or handcrafted, molded into politics in their early 20s. And that's just something that a lot of people are contentious about.
no, I agree. I think that, I mean, part of it is just sort of like the ambition of our age, you know, and that a lot of young people are very ambitious and not necessarily humbled by much these days. And I think that can be a kind of dangerous mix sometimes.
And final question, did you have fun?
I did. This was a great interview, actually. Probably, honestly, I can say this without exaggerating. This is probably one of the best interviews that I've done.
Wow,
so
thank you.
I really respect it. And thanks so much for all of your kind words about me, and thanks for giving me this opportunity.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, we're very grateful to have you here, obviously, and you're such, you know, well-respected figure, especially here in Vancouver. And my name is Bo Fang, as always. This is JJ McCullough. And where can they find you? What's your social media?
Well, they can just find me on JJ McCullough on YouTube. If that is too hard to spell, you can just Google, or you can just YouTube JJ Canada, and you'll find me there. And then that will also have links to all my other social media stuff on Twitter and Instagram and elsewhere.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time. This is the UBC Students for Freedom of Expression, and have a wonderful day.